The Open Therapy Institute is addressing bias in mental health care. Go to our website, opentherapyinstitute.org. We have CE credit workshops about overlooked issues in the field. You can go to our workshop page and register now and become a member. And for those looking for a therapist, we match people with someone who's highly skilled and truly open. Just contact us through the contact page on the website or email us at info@opentherapyinstitute.org. Hi, I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and I'm speaking with Dr. Andrew Hartz of the Open Therapy Institute in another installment of our Open Therapy podcast. The Open Therapy Institute has a workshop coming up on racial reductionism that I'm very much looking forward to. It's such an important topic, and I think it's really touched most of American life at this point, this kind of DEI style language around race and privilege. And we've talked a little bit before about specifically anti-white rhetoric in the culture, but
Yes.
I'm interested in your thoughts on this more broadly, especially as it pertains to therapy and how therapists are being instructed to talk with their clients, but also just in terms of culture and how it's impacting the culture. I remember a hypothetical case that we were given when I was in graduate school for an ethics class, where the hypothetical was you are a school counselor and you have a Latina student, so a female of Hispanic background, who is a high school student, and she comes to you because she wants to drop her math class. If you allow her to drop her math class without first addressing themes of internalized misogyny and internalized white supremacy, you are in ethical violation because you haven't done your job as her counselor. You're supposed to see these themes and raise these themes to your client.
Yes.
And so I was really struck by that because we're not given any other detail about this client, and we're automatically supposed to go straight into assuming that the sort of privileged, marginalized identity factors are the most important things to address with this client. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, really interesting. I have kind of, maybe this is a little bit adjacent to what you were saying, but um, I have like very, very profound, deeply held spiritual beliefs about the universal value of human life, and that, racial and ethnic differences are related to illusion and division, and are, I think, really harmful at a spiritual level, a very deep spiritual level. And I believe that for a long time. But I remember in my training really being bombarded with this stuff and not really given an opportunity to get away from it. And I tried very hard. This is my person. I tried very hard to keep this stuff at bay and kind of just say, well, I'm going to treat individuals and I can be empathic towards them, but I'm going to treat them for who they are. I think it's like a heart-to-heart personal connection that's nuanced. And by the way, like I in my training, like I was in Brooklyn, I was in Manhattan, I was doing low fee care. I don't I might have treated a couple of white patients in the first like 4 or 5 years that I was doing it. Like it was not really a lot. And in my defense, I think I did okay. I think my patients were happy, most of them, with the work, and I think we did some good treatments. But there was a certain point where I remember not being able to resist this ideology anymore. So, and I think it's centered in part around the idea of white privilege, because I couldn't accept white privilege without also making a racial identification and entering into a worldview where I see people in racial terms. So the argument from people who wanted to force you've got to accept that white privilege is real would say, hey, look, if you look at advantages on average, white people have this or that or this other thing, or they, the Band-Aids match their flesh tone better and this type of thing. And I'd, kind of say, I'm fine with making more Band-Aids. I think we have clear Band-Aids now anyway. And they, you know what? They never really matched my flesh tone so great, by the way. But like I would kind of not want to make the identification, but I just kept getting pushed and I think really demonized. And I needed to have a way of defending myself of like, well, actually there's benefits that other races have, and there's times where white people are explicitly and deliberately discriminated against. So how does that balance against this other thing? Like there's more here. But there was a point where I felt like I couldn't resist it anymore. And I like there's this passage from in the Brothers Karamazov where one of the characters, there's really four brothers. The fourth one is illegitimate, and he's a very twisted guy. And he feeds a dog a hunk of meat that has a needle in it
Mm.
just to watch it suffer. Very dark person. And that's what it was like. That's what swallowing the idea of race and white privilege felt like. And I felt it in my body. I felt the poison go in.
Mm.
I felt the poison go in. There was a time where it just in order to like protect myself, to be able to engage in debate, to be able to like get through my training, I at some point I swallowed the poison. And I could see how this shaped everything. Yeah, how it impacted me. As soon as the poison went in, I saw things differently. And all of a sudden, there were new dilemmas and challenges that I had not encountered beforehand. Um, I saw other people's racial identifications more. I saw racial aggression more. I think the dominant response, honestly, from it was to feel more afraid
Mm.
of how much racial animus is in the world that I think I had really been oblivious to in all directions. And it made me more skeptical of multiculturalism being viable and more scared about the potential for racial animus to explode and even contribute to global conflict. I mean, really stuff that I had not encountered or really ever thought about. Um, and I've seen this in lots of people. I would this was like, years ago, I remember like people would tell me like, "Oh, what's your ancestry? Like what's your ethnic makeup?" Like, "Oh, well like I have like an ancestor from Denmark and another one from Poland or whatever." And people were all talking about this stuff. And it was just clear this is on people's minds, and it's sinking into their unconscious, it's sinking into their body, it's shaping how their eyes work in terms like it's really soaking in. I never had a conversation with somebody about what their genome was. I know that some of this is related to the popularity of 23andMe and stuff, but just that there's a salience to these racial identifications that seems totally obviously on people's minds. And I think it's related to the way that a lot of people like me were forced to make these types of identifications. And all it's brought me so many problems, so
Mm.
much more tension, so much more. It's actually like I have to like find the immune system, find the kind of like protective system to like identify the poison or the antidote or whatever our metaphor is, and actually like get it out to like resume to be who I was. And it all was the Trojan horse, really, I think one of the central things was this concept of white privilege. Are
Mm.
you going to deny that white people have historically had advantages in the US? So then you must agree with white privilege. So then, but the thing that the hunk of meat they're getting you to swallow has this needle in it of this racial identification that you're being forced to take in. And a lot of the slogans are like that. Like white rage and white tears and stuff. They're two-word slogans that are just stuffed full of hostility and hate, and that in order to defend against them, you're kind of forced to make these identifications just to push back on them, and then now you're caught in the web. And my main concern, and I know you and I have talked about this, is like I think our field is doing this to the therapist because for me, the place where I was really bombarded with this and where I think it actually did have a big impact on my psyche was through the constant focus on this in my training.
Hmm.
But I know it's not just happening to people in our field. It's happening to people around the country, and they're struggling to find the vocabulary to describe what they've been through. Where I never questioned that multiculturalism was a wonderful thing until I encountered this stuff, and it started to scare me about where this stuff really is leading. Um, and that's a horrifying thought, by the way, to think that multiculturalism would inevitably lead to this or that it will intensify in this direction. That is absolutely horrifying. It's a death note to civilization, and it spells that the next several decades of life in America and probably in lots of other places are going to be truly horrific. Um, so it's just bombarded with these like huge dilemmas and conflicts. And I'll give you a chance to say something, but just I know people are wrestling with this, and I'm wondering, and I think our field, if it were in the right space, could actually help people have conversations about this stuff and how these ideas impacted them, and how they want to move forward, which is a huge thing to unpack and talk about. And I think we're not having the most productive, healthiest, most authentic conversations about this.
Hmm. I like the metaphor of swallowing the needle. I think that's a really
Yeah.
useful one. I think that I can relate to that because I felt that once I was sort of forced to take this perspective through counselor training, where it was really pushed very hard, it was very hard to resist seeing race more than I had seen it before, and making a bigger deal of it. And I would be quick to acknowledge that demographic characteristics can be predictive of certain things in a person's
Right,
life, or
right,
can be
right, right.
indicative of a potential to have experienced more of this or more of that, whatever that might be. But the thing that's so
Right.
shocking about the way that race is being taught is how it is so it's so reductionist that it's being held up as if it is one of the most or the most important characteristic that will inform you about a person's life, desires, conflicts, and it's just patently
And
false.
it's making it true.
Yeah, yeah, it's
I
trying to
mean,
make it
that's the
true.
thing, and
Yeah,
it's working.
yeah.
And it's entirely coming from the social justice movement, is making they're creating the thing that they claim to be against. And it's not just, I mean, advertisements and movies and TV shows and video games, and
Mhm.
they're bombarding people with this racialized worldview. I think I can't remember if I shared this here or not, but I did have this experience of I went to a church in the city with a dear friend of mine who's not white, or he's half white, he's mixed race. And we go into this beautiful church, and we get out, we see all the stained glass and the architecture and everything. And his observation is about Jesus having blue eyes
Mhm.
and that being racist. And it was a perfect encapsulation to me of what's happened, both what I saw with my students when I was teaching and what I see other people, where it's like you're in one of the most beautiful cathedrals in the country. And you can be thinking about art and architecture and scripture and God and truth and beauty and society and history. And that's what people are thinking about. That's what
Mhm.
they're going to go to. And I'm not convinced, that people can't make like that people would make Jesus look like him, especially 150 years ago or 200 years ago when they didn't have the same type of thinking about it should be historically accurate, and this is what most likely he did look like or didn't or something. They didn't have that knowledge or weren't thinking about it, and it made sense that they'd always make him look like the way people look where they lived.
Hmm.
Seems totally reasonable, not at all racist, no malice really
Hmm.
there at all. Um, and if we're really looking historically, he was not a black man. Like it's like that's fine if he was going to look more Middle Eastern, but not black. But I don't care if black churches have a black Jesus. Like
Right.
and I hope that's not the first thing that I think about every time I go into a church. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just
that was one of the things. Like I really hoped that in my multiculturalism class when I was in grad school,
yeah,
I dreaded it because I had a sense of what I thought it was going to be, even though I'd never been exposed to those ideas as strongly as I started hearing them there. I had a sense, oh no, I hope this isn't what I think it's going to be. I hoped it would be these really like an opportunity to have exactly the kind of conversation you were talking about, where we can really have these nuanced conversations about how people grapple with issues of identity, whatever that might be, and how to be more open as a counselor. How can we open ourselves up more so that we're ready to take on the different perspectives that we might encounter and be ready to hear the different kinds of experiences that we might encounter. But instead it was a real closing. And one of the things that we were instructed very strongly to do was to increase our clients' racial identity salience, which is exactly that thing you're talking about when you go into a
right,
church
right,
and you're
right.
scanning for race cues. You're scanning for where can I find the problems? And that's the critical in critical social justice. It's the I'm going to critique things on the basis of race.
It's made like if you were in the New York subway, the past 10 years of ads on the subway have been truly fascinating
Mm.
because there was a period where they really tried to get everything had to be particular proportional in this particular way. I actually just saw this movie. I think it was about fortune, or I saw a trailer for a movie, and I think it was about fortune tellers.
Okay.
But the DEI in this trailer was so perfect. You could not have, like, I'm telling you, like, they had a couple of white guys. They were both liberal. They were not very much on screen, but they did have a couple. It was more women than men,
Hmm.
like eight black people, like each getting their fortune read. They had every, some they had a Sikh guy. They had a
Wow.
like it was just like they hit every box and everything was perfect in terms of the proportions and the white guys were kind of like generic and forgettable and liberal seeming, and the black people had a range of personalities, and all the DEI was perfect in this trailer. And it was like I I could just tell that was the point of the movie. Like it's like I don't know how much this is even about fortune telling or if this is just a DEI thing. And I could tell how much money and time and resources went to curating it that way. Like where it's like, oh, we have a black person, but they fulfill a stereotype. Like they're like cheating on their girlfriend or they have a legal issue or something. And it's like, oh, we got to cut that out. The black
Mhm.
people have to be charming in this particular way and they have to seem not like the stereotype, but also human. And the Asians can't be in computer science, and the like you can't have the Jewish person can't be like working diamonds or so whatever it is, like or they can, but they have to be very generous minded or something. Like it's like
Mhm.
there's no way you could get a random sample of fortune tellers where no, not one stereotype is confirmed. No way. No way. So they were editing and editing and editing to get it exactly DEI perfect. And it's like, it's impressive what they got together. But it's like, give me a break.
Well, it
Like,
sort of loses its heart after a while. It just becomes propaganda.
it's just propaganda and it loses all of its spontaneity and nuance. And you can't learn anything. You can't learn anything from like encountering something unexpected.
Hmm.
Like everything has a DEI type of motive of they have to be this way or that. Um, And so, but it's just like clearly the preoccupation of the filmmakers
Mhm.
has to be as much on that as the content. But it's like what makes the movie interesting is when you just follow the content and see what you see.
Mhm.
Like, I don't care if 70% of the people who are seeing the fortune tellers are black. That would be interesting to me.
Mhm.
And maybe they're mostly, maybe a lot of them want to engage in witchcraft on their ex-lovers or something like that would be fascinating. I don't know. It's probably not true, but I just like you learn something,
Mhm.
but you can't learn anything with this. It's like you know where it's going to go from, so it's not worth watching.
Mhm.
But it just shows like, but I'm so used to it. But like on the New York subway, you would see like there was a period where they would try to do that. Then there was a period where they just basically it was only black people.
Mhm.
And it was like everybody had to everybody had to be black, and there was like no white people.
Mhm.
And then there was this change where they just made everything a cartoon.
Oh,
And
yes.
it was it was like
Yeah.
only cartoons and like text focused, or they'd show an image of the product with text and or a cartoon, especially like animal cartoons,
Mhm.
so that they don't have and they their skin tones would be like orange or purple or something that you couldn't make
Yeah.
out. Maybe even purple's too much, so it's blue and orange. It's just something that's totally so they did it that way. Now some white people are coming back, but it's like everything about the ad has to keep this schema in mind constantly because people are just looking, waiting to pounce. There's too much of this. There's not enough of this. What about this? And
Mhm.
they've just like, they've, I mean, the advertising industry is partly at fault for this, but they've primed the entire society to be hyper preoccupied with race and ready to fight about it constantly. And this has not I think the seed has been planted, but it hasn't like if this trajectory keeps going, like it will ultimately lead to war. Like it
Mhm.
is a inherently violent and hateful way to think about people when you reduce them to these categories. Like there's an aggression that's really inevitable that's going to emerge when people start thinking of other people in these terms. So it's I think it's just total poison.
Well, how do we get the needle out, just to follow that metaphor? Because if people like, I this is something I really resented also. I resented the degree to which I started to notice it. I want to go back to not
Yes,
noticing. I don't want to be critiquing the ads. I don't want to be noticing what
right.
color people are in a show that I'm enjoying. I don't want to notice that. I don't want to feel like I'm being bombarded by racial messaging. But I also don't want to care if the lead guy is a black guy in a role that would what it, like these historical dramas. I don't want to care. I don't want to care. I just want to enjoy the content or the art for what it is, or let the advertising wash over me, or go into the church and see black Jesus and not think about it, or whatever it is. I want to go back to not seeing that and just seeing individuals as individuals to the degree that I did before. It's the needle goes in and then we're all thinking like this, whether we want
Yeah.
to or not. You're either against it or you're for it. But again, it's kind of comes back to being forced into binary choices.
Yes. And it's yeah, I think it can easily just get entrenched and spiral to like, I mean, to murderous like catastrophes. I don't know. I don't know. My sense is that the best way to get there is to talk about it and to just have honest conversations about how we're impacted by it and how it's making us feel about different things. I I I think that if we approach those with like good intentions and candor, that's the path to get there. Like, I definitely noticed like one of the things that I noticed in terms of the New York subway advertising thing, there was a period where it was always a white woman and a black man,
Mhm.
like every single time. And it seemed like I had never cared about like I had known lots of black men who were married to white women who were mentors and advisors, and it just never occurred to me to give a fuck about that. And but there was something about these that it seemed like there was like this aggressive attempt to like emasculate white men
Hmm.
where
Oh, interesting.
I had heard that like that was a fear of why some white guys were racist against black people
Mm,
was because they were worried about black men emasculating them. I had never felt that.
mm,
But until it was like the woke ads felt like and TV shows felt like they were really trying to exclude and emasculate white men, and that
mm.
there was a kind of hatred of white men that both the woman and the man were communicating that really I don't know. It's just like, and it's with all this stuff, it just wasn't stuff that I was really cared that much about, and until I felt like totally bombarded by it. So
That's so interesting. I never thought of that particular spin. I can see that now that you say that, I can imagine that, but I guess I would have and I've noticed that too, that specific like very purposeful racial pairing. And
yeah,
what I assumed was going on was that there was a representation for white people, but they had to also represent another marginalized class, and they consider women to be marginalized, so they're doing it. And of course, we all know that
no,
as we
yeah,
hear, the cishet white man is the one that we've heard those voices enough, as I've been
yes,
told many
yes,
times. So
yes,
it's
yes,
the
yes,
last person you want to see in a lead role or in an ad, the great evil white man. So I wouldn't have thought of that particular angle, but I see that. I see what you're saying.
yeah. Yeah, but
It's interesting.
but I think people are like the problem is like I mean and this is our current conversation is part of this too, but it's like the number of like taboo we have to be able to talk about this stuff. So I mean, and maybe for example, like maybe my reaction to these ads was misplaced. Um, but like I just don't see how we get anywhere and learn without like talking about it. Like I think there's particular hostility towards white men in the
Mhm.
woke movement, and I think a particularly emasculating impulse in that movement too, towards white men in particular.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, and it's like, and I hate how much we're talking about it. I hate how much but I have to think this is so much a part of what founding OTI was about. I have to think that this is impacting the psyche of millions and millions of people throughout the country. And I just don't know where they're talking about it, where they're able to have these conversations to make sense of what they're experiencing. How do they get the needle out? How do they get the poison out? What are they doing? I don't know where they're going to process this. And my guess is a lot of people are trying to repress it. I don't think ultimately that's going to work. Um, but I hope that OTI can be a place where people can have these conversations, both patients, but also therapists.
Yeah, and I hope so too. And I think that the workshop coming up is a really good place to focus some of that conversation. I'm really looking forward to the perspectives of the presenters and the panel.
Yes, yes.
Hmm. I don't know if you want to give a plug for that.
We have a work. I don't know the day. Is it
December 7th, I
December
believe.
7th? We have a workshop on racial and cultural reductionism that's really great. And Mike Strambler is giving a talk. He just has an article that was accepted and will hopefully be published too soon in the American Psychologists about racial and cultural reductionism, and Ira Moses, who's got a fascinating talk on the topic too. And Carol Sherwood is going to be joining us as a discussant for a panel after the talks to talk about these themes. So register now, and I think they're fascinating. People have loved these workshops. They're full of useful information. They're not like boring continuing ed workshops for therapists, like most of them are so boring.
They're
But
not
these,
boring. They're so
yeah,
great. It's really nice to be able to have open discussion of topics that feel very closed and very taboo in counselor training right now. And I
yes,
imagine in a lot of the continuing ed training as well. And so the feedback is really positive. It's really refreshing. People feel very grateful to have a space opening up for this.
yeah. I'm really looking forward to it.
And I think that also one of the things I'll just say really briefly is that I am definitely more optimistic based on just encounters with normal people. Online, you start to see this stuff spin out. And in
Right.
DEI trainings that people are being forced to do, and in
Right.
counselor training was really bad. I know someone who had this in a medical continuing ed training. They had a DEI module
Right.
where they were forced to, when they were asked about are white men, something like, are white men overly privileged in society? They
Right.
tried to
Right.
answer false, and they were forced to go back and correct it to true before they could submit the module. It was some
Right.
framework
Right.
like that.
Right.
And
Right.
so
Right.
people are seeing this all over the place. But if you just talk to normal people, I think I think that a large number of people see right through this and find it objectionable, no matter what their racial background
Well,
is.
then we need to be able to say it.
Hmm.
Because I think that the arguments against this ideology, a lot of them that are presented are weak.
Hmm.
What the way that it's often talked about is like it's a waste of money. That is not my
That's
critique
not
of
the
this stuff.
problem.
It's
Yeah.
like we do all kinds of things that waste money that I am much less upset about. It's the aggression, it's the forcing the schema onto people. It's making people swallow the poison. And I think that's going to have lots of negative downstream costs on our culture. Um, yeah. So I hope people can talk more candidly about what their experiences are, how they're impacted by them, and actually make arguments that are more directly addressing the issue. People are shy to do it. It's like I think like it's so interesting. I think there's something really meaningful. I know we need to wrap up, but there is something very meaningful about the fact that the arguments against it are so indirect. Like
Hmm.
instead of this, let's learn about the founding fathers. Or like it's just they're missing the I don't know what they have a hard time saying you're forcing this racial schema on people that's making entrenching these worldviews in ways that can hurt people. These talks are full of aggression towards white people and men that's really hateful. Uh it's not just like their claims aren't evidence-based or something, as important as that is, or they don't support free speech, which is important, or we should do more for veterans or something. It's like very well, probably true. Um, but people are very hesitant to actually name the real problems with these things. I don't know why people are so shy to be direct. It's not hateful. I don't think we should not be aggressive or hateful towards anyone. We can just be direct. I don't
I
know why that's so
I
hard.
think people are really conflict averse. I think many people
Uh,
struggle
yeah,
with assertiveness, and really it's so this is I believe that that is essentially a positive thing about human nature, that we want to get
right,
along and we want to have peace and harmony with others. And ideologies like this prey on exactly that. They are able to slip in because they prey on the desire that
right,
people have for harmony. And if something is presented in billboard fashion, like everybody thinks this is
right,
how
right.
everybody thinks, this is how good people think, then many people will struggle to mount any kind of counter to that, and especially a really direct one. I tend to be a really direct person, so I know that I can do that, but I still found myself terrified when I was in a counselor training
Yes,
program and it was
yes,
coming
yes,
at me from all angles. I mean, it was really a
yes. It is
difficult
hard.
emotional decision.
That's really important to say. And I do think it is hard to be nice and forgiving and open-minded, but direct about something that is so socially taboo. I don't think it should be socially taboo to talk about these things, but I know it is. And we can that's part of why it's hard.
Well, and I think that your point about we should talk about it is probably
Yes.
the most important point, because talking about it
Yes.
openly challenges the assumption that it's universal, that everybody
Right,
thinks
right.
this way. And if more people can just fearlessly come into conversations where they talk about what's wrong with it, that can open the space for others to do the same thing.
Yeah, without hate, without nasty language, without ad hominem, candid, positive, but assertive,
Hmm.
direct. That's the tone that I think people are struggling to get to that right note. They slip too far one way or the other. But
Absolutely. I think this conversation is a really good example of
Okay.
that. Thank you very much for being willing to go there with me.
Thanks, Leslie.